Effects of messiness on preferences for simplicity. The research question used was, how does experiencing perceived messiness influence a consumer's cognitions, preferences, and choices? It is important to note that messiness is subjective, so some people can tolerate different levels of messiness before they would actually consider it messy. It is also important to note that the experiments were conducted in a messiness that was not created by self. There were no experiments conducted when the experience of messiness was self-induced. The hypothesis used was messiness is an aversive state, and consumers are motivated to attenuate this state by seeking simplicity in their cognitions, preferences, and choices. Breaking the research question down, it is basically asking, when messiness is most noticeable, what effect does this have on the consumer's actions such as forming product categorizations, willingness to pay, and variety in their choices? Another secondary question is, when the need for simplicity is satiated, do the effects of messiness disappear? The boundary condition in these experiments were political conservatives are more susceptible to messiness primes compared to liberals. The experiments were used to gather information on consumers' daily ability and want to process knowledge, their preferences, and the type of choices and decisions consumers would make after being introduced to something they would perceive as messy. Why is the research relevant to marketers? The studies show strong evidence that perceived messiness as a primer can have important downstream effects on real-life consumer behavior. The aversion of messiness might root in the assumption that disorganization and messiness impair the efficiency of survival of complex systems. That is, the dislike of messiness could be perceived to inhibit the ability for complex systems to survive. Behavioral priming literature also shows that consumers' mindsets and behaviors assimilate to contextual clues. The experiments indeed support the hypothesis. There was direct support for the effects of contextual messiness on consumers that revealed evidence of a need for simplicity. This information can be used to guide the ideals behind marketing campaigns and brand or product management.
So experiment 1A was about initially testing whether the experiencing of messiness would activate a need for simplicity, and if that simplicity tendency would reflect in consumers' cognition. So they went about testing this by using the product categorization as the method to test it. So they're testing their hypothesis that the messiness activates a need for simplicity, and thus experiencing messiness should cause participants to categorize products in a simpler manner, forming fewer categories and having less overlap between categories. So they basically showed them a bunch of different products, asked them to sort them into categories, and then depending on the number of different categories they put those products in, that would be the test of simpler versus more complex. For the method of study 1A, they had 48 undergraduates who participated for partial fulfillment of course credits, and they were given 3 different conditions that would be in a cubicle. So they were given a messy condition that had crumpled paper all over, pens and pieces of paper left messily on the desk. They had a tidy condition where they had the same items on the desk, but they were well organized, papers in a pile, pens were neatly arranged, things like that. And then they had a control group where none of these items were on the desk at all. So they did a pre-test to make sure that the manipulation indeed activated messiness and disorganization. So they were just trying to get the perception of people if it was truly messy or not. And then they had participants complete a survey that measured their need for simplicity, as well as measuring their affect, so negative or positive, to determine their current mood. So after all this in computerized tasks, the participants were asked to sort 33 different products into groups on the basis of how they thought the products would fit together, and they weren't really given exact instructions on that, but they would just kind of let them freely sort these products into whatever groups they thought made sense. So for the results of study 1A, so the participants' responses were coded using Scott H's measure. So this measure takes information available, the number of groups formed, and the extent to which information was sorted into multiple groups. As a manipulation check, the participants also answered 2 additional questions about how messy tidy they perceived their desk to be, as well as several questions about the possible purpose of the study, and none actually correctly guessed the hypothesis of the study. So with those results, or with the actual results now, those in the messy cubicle did perceive their desk as being messier than those in the tiny condition or the control. When looking at the Scott H scores, the smaller score indicated a greater simplicity. So the messy condition participants categorization was simpler. They scored an average of 2.27 versus the tidy condition of 2.91 and the control condition of 2.80. So the tidy and control conditions didn't differ. The need for simplicity. So the single factor ANOVA revealed a significant effect of prime on the need for simplicity measure, with participants in the messy condition displaying a higher need for simplicity than those in the tidy or control conditions. An alternative explanation to this, the messy desk caused participants to leave the cubicle sooner and spend less time on the task, which produced the observed results. But they found that not to be true, since the total time spent on the task did not differ across the three conditions, and the feelings of the positive or negative feelings and the stress and agitation also didn't vary as a function of the manipulation. So overall in study 1A, they found that participants working at the messy desk displayed simpler cognitions because messiness induces a need for simplicity. So moving on now to study 1B. So the main goal of experiment 1B was to conceptually replicate the experiment of 1A, but they were going to use a different messiness primer in a different paradigm. So then in this example, instead of asking them to sort the different products into different categories, they were measuring their willingness to pay for a t-shirt, which I'll talk about here in a minute. So their aim was to show that the messiness effect isn't just limited to product categorization, but also extends preferences for visual simplicity. So they measured their willingness to pay for these two different t-shirts, that the only difference was there was a different picture on the front. One had a little bit simpler looking design, and one had a little bit more complex looking design. So the hypothesis was that the participants in the messy situation would prefer the simpler looking shirt over the more complex shirt. So instead of messy cubicles in this experiment, they employed a subtle priming procedure to cognitively activate the concept of messiness. So they're interested in understanding if being mentally messy would yield the same results as being physically messy, or as being in a physically messy environment. So in this case, they weren't in the actual messy environment of the cubicle. They did a priming test to get them in the mindset of being messy or disorganized. So the method used in study 1B, there were 63 undergraduates that participated for partial fulfillment of course credits. They began with language comprehension task where they completed scrambled sentences to activate the concept of messiness. So like I talked to you just a little bit ago, they did that instead of physically being in a messy environment. So after doing the language primer, the participants then filled out the same need for simplicity measure as they did in the first experiment. After that, they were shown pictures of the simple and complex t-shirts and asked to indicate the price they were willing to pay for each items. So I mentioned earlier, both shirts were black and everything was the same about the t-shirts other than the picture on the front that was more simple or more complex. So after they completed that exercise, they were asked to complete an anagram test, as it's shown that people who have are more depleted, their resources are more depleted, would complete fewer anagrams as compared to non-depleted individuals. So looking at the results of study 1B, the participants in the messy condition were willing to pay more for the simple t-shirt, $22, than those in the tidy condition, $17.56, or the control condition, $16.24. So participants in the tidy and control conditions did not differ. As far as the need for simplicity, the participants in the messy condition had a greater need for simplicity than those in the tidy or control conditions. And an alternative explanation, so the manipulation did not affect the number of correctly solved anagrams, which suggests that the messiness prime did not deplete their self-regulatory resources. So experiment 1B ended up corroborating the findings of experiment 1A with a different activation of messiness and a different dependent measure, the willingness to pay. So the effect is not induced by resource depletion. So moving on to study 1C. So the main goal of this study was to show the effect of messiness can also extend to a behavioral level. So they tested to see the extent participants seek variety in their consumption choices when messiness is activated. So as more varieties in a choice set entails less simplicity, they expected to see the need for simplicity induced by experiencing messiness to lead consumers to form simpler choice sets and display less variety. So if they were in the messy environment in this test, they expected them to have less variety in their choices overall. So they again controlled for resource depletion in the study by using a Stroop task. The method of study 1C, so they used 45 undergraduates that participated for partial fulfillment of course credits. The manipulation was of the messy, tidy, and control conditions was the exact same as experiment 1A. Participants completed the need for simplicity measure as the same in the previous two studies. They then took a Stroop test, which showed they showed some words in a font color that matched the semantic meaning. So maybe grass would be in the color green versus the color red. So they showed some words that matched and some words that didn't. And then they measured the average reaction time to serve as a depletion measure. So participants also completed the choice measure outside the cubicles. So after they left the cubicles, they were told they could choose 5 different candies as a small gift for participating. There were 5 boxes with 5 different colors and flavors of candies on the desk, and they could choose any combination of the 5 candies. The results of experiment 1C. So at the same time, as the same in experiment 1, participants in the messy cubicle related their desks as messier than those in the tidier control conditions. They measured simplicity of choice and the number of different candies the participant chose with a smaller selection. So participants in the messy condition did choose fewer candies, 2.8 on average, than those in the tidy, who chose 3.73, or those in the control, who chose 3.87. So in the tidy and control conditions didn't differ. Participants in the messy condition also had a greater need for simplicity than those in the tidy and control conditions. As far as the alternative explanation, the average reaction times and errors on the Stroop task did not differ across, so that suggests that resource depletion can't account for the effect of messiness. So overall, experiment 1C demonstrated that participants in the messy room sought less variety in their choices than those in the tidy or control room.
Now moving on to study 2. Study 2 is about replicating the effect of messiness in a real store setting. For this experiment, a study was conducted on a weekday between 4 and 6 p.m. in a small supermarket. The experimenters approached people outside the store and told them the study concerned shopping behavior. And if they were to participate, they would get €5 to shop for 5 candy bars based on their own preference. Afterward, they would answer a number of different questions and they could get the candy bars as a gift. The study would take no more than 10 minutes to complete. And in total, 24 people signed up with an average age group of 27.92. So they were instructed to just walk through the store, and the candy bar aisle was located at the back of the store, and they could pick any 5 candy bars of the total options of 12 with an average price of 37 cents, and they would come out and get reimbursed and were to answer a few survey questions. And the main purpose of the survey questions were to determine the relation between messiness, need for simplicity, crowdedness, and variety of candies chosen. And this slide talks about the study 2 results. And for this, they regressed various factors and came up with the results and conclusion. And this was based on the beta and the t statistic and also the p-value for each regression result. So this table summarizes the various factors regressed and the results and conclusion. To start with, they regressed the variety of candies chosen and the store messiness measure. And the result was that more disorganized the participants perceived the store to be, the less varieties they sought. And the next one was the need for simplicity in the store messiness measure, and they perceived that the more disorganized the store, they needed more simplicity. And the third one, they did a mediation analysis in which the simplicity was a mediator, and they found that need for simplicity fully mediated the effect of messiness on the variety of candies chosen. And also there was no effect on the store crowdedness on the variety of candy chosen, and no effect of messiness on the time spent, feelings, and average price per candy. Moving on to study 3. Study 3 claims that satiating need for simplicity when experiencing messiness breaks line between messiness and simplicity. And this experiment was conducted in a lab setting where 86 participants and all undergrads were asked to participate in the study. And as a pretest for a future study, the participants were randomly assigned to conditions of 2 prime tasks, which is messy versus tidy, and 3 dots, like connecting the dots that kids play, and they were given connecting the dots for simple versus neutral versus no design. And the main purpose of this was to lead up to a study in which they determined the need for simplicity and determined the willingness to pay for simple t-shirts. This slide talks about the results for study 3, and this measures the willingness to pay for a simple t-shirt when participants were subject to various messiness conditions. In the plot here, the y-axis represents willingness to pay for a simple t-shirt. Large score indicates a higher willingness to pay for a simple t-shirt. Specifically, the participants in the no dots condition scored higher on the willingness to pay index when primed with messiness compared to tidiness. Similarly, participants in the neutral dots condition also scored higher on the index when primed with messiness compared to tidiness. However, participants satiated with the need for simplicity by connecting dots to form simple drawings, the effect of messiness completely disappeared. Participants' willingness to pay in the simple dots condition did not differ when exposed to messiness prime versus tidiness primes. Continuing with the results for study 3, in this plot here the y-axis represents the need for simplicity. Larger score indicates a higher need for simplicity. Participants primed with messiness showed a higher need for simplicity than those primed with tidiness in both no dots and neutral dots condition. When participants had an opportunity to satiate the need for simplicity did not differ between the messy and tidy conditions. Moving on to study 4. Study 4 aims to establish a boundary condition for the effect of messiness on the need for simplicity. They conjectured that the effect of messiness would have a stronger effect on people who prefer being organized and are less tolerant to messiness. To test this hypothesis, they measured participants' political ideology. They proposed that conservatives will show a higher need for simplicity when messiness is primed compared to when tidiness is primed, whereas liberals should not show this enhanced need for simplicity. This was done in a lab setup with 56 total people and all undergrads, and the participants were filled out a single item measure to measure their conservatism and liberalism, and they were randomly assigned to either messy conditions or the tidy conditions, and the purpose was to determine the need for simplicity and to determine willingness to pay for simple t-shirts. This slide talks about the results for the study 4. And this shows that conservatives will show a higher need for simplicity when messiness is primed, whereas liberals will not. As you can see from the plot here, high on the ideology scale, that's conservatives, were willing to pay more for simple t-shirts in the messy condition compared to the tidy conditions. And willingness to pay for low on the ideology scale, that's for liberals, did not differ between the messy and tidy conditions at all. And the same kind of results were obtained for the need for simplicity, as in the case for willingness to pay for simple t-shirt designs.
Conclusions. The study showed that experiencing messiness leads to a simplicity tendency. The reason is aversion of messiness activates a basic need for simplicity, which is then reflected in subsequent behavior of consumers. Across 6 experiments, it was found that there was consistent evidence to support this hypothesis and also establish a boundary condition. Study also showed that satiating the need for simplicity removes the effect of messiness on subsequent behavior, as shown in experiment 3, and that messiness produces simplifying behavior only when people possess the need for simplicity and being organized, as shown in experiment 4, which showed that effects of messiness were shown not to motivate political liberals versus conservatives. This is due to liberals being generally more open-minded and less concerned about instability, ambiguity, and chaos, and therefore more tolerant to disorganization and mess. Study also found that experiencing messiness decreased consumers' cognitive complexity and induced consumers to form simple representations of product information, which is associated with heuristic information processing. Therefore, priming messiness, for instance, leads to an increased use of heuristic in consumer behavior. Main takeaways from this study: experiencing messiness leads to simplicity tendency instead of complex or messy minds. Consumers tend to use representative and availability heuristics and non-compensatory strategies such as elimination by aspects when primed with messiness. Priming consumers only elicits motivated behavior when consumers possess the primed goal in question. Managerial relevance to marketing. Increased perceived store messiness or disorganization inhibited consumers' variety-seeking behavior. This can be used for organizing the store in order to prime the consumers to buy the product that the store carries. This emphasizes the importance of store atmospheric factors in influencing consumers' behavior, and different atmospheric elements can lead to consumers using various heuristics to make decisions, and the managers can exploit this behavioral change. Study also found that messiness motivated only a certain type of people to seek simplicity. This can be used as a tool to establish target markets, fine-tune product offerings, and manipulate pricing specifically to satiate needs of people who possess these primed goals.
Relevance of findings to market research. The research supports that messiness induces a need for simplicity. Consumers in perceived messy conditions were shown to display simpler cognitions, were willing to pay more for simpler things, and sought out less variety than consumers in an environment they did not perceive to be messy. The research shows that the need for simplicity does not waver between those primed with perceived messy or tidy conditions. The level of simplicity sought after did change based on perceived messiness, but the need did not disappear in those in a perceived tidy condition. To summarize, for marketing research purposes, being able to predict and understand the primer of a target consumer can help elicit a desired result.